Invasion, by Stephen Lake. The Guardian Series Part 7. Paul's team raced across the African continent at supersonic speeds as they hurried to reach the location that Central had told them about. "Shouldn't we be teleporting into our destination rather than trying to do it the Top Gun way?" asked Jack against the roar of the wind. Paul frowned at this. "Teleporting is definitely faster. But we don't know what we're walking into, so I'd rather play it safe and do this with our eyes open rather than risk falling into a trap," he replied. Jack furrowed his brow at this. While he did indeed prefer getting to their destination the fastest way possible, he also had to admit that Paul was right. Fighting against the Emperor's army was a dangerous ordeal at best, and a lethal one at worst. So approaching this battle with a multitude of caution was definitely the best way to proceed. He then turned and studied Paul as his mind was laser-focused on the land ahead of him. The longer he served by Paul's side, the more Jack was coming to understand why Paul was leading this expedition, and not someone else. Paul may not have been a military-trained leader, but his ability to think ahead and problem-solve on the fly, even in the most difficult of situations, was almost second to none. That made him the best person to lead this mission. Even better than Jack himself. "How soon until we're on target?" shouted Paul a minute later. He already knew the answer to that, as he could sense all of the Rexes, bulls, and other monsters just ahead of them. But he still relied on James's incredible navigational abilities to ensure that they arrived at the correct location to avoid any issues. "We should be on top of them in about 8 minutes, replied James. "What's our current airspeed?" asked Paul. "Mach 2. Paul took a moment to process this, and soon realized that their final destination was a little over 200 miles away. Deciding that it would be a good idea to check in before they arrived, he activated his communicator. "Central, this is DB-05631. What's the current sitrep on our target LZ?" he asked. Destin, who was flying to his left, overheard Paul's message, and grinned at this. The longer they were together as a team, the more Paul was sounding and acting like a military commander, and he liked that. "DB-05631, this is Central. Local units report LZ is hot, and that the monster count has more than doubled in the last hour. Advise extreme caution," came the reply. Paul frowned at this. Things were quickly devolving, and he didn't like that. "Central, if that's true, then I don't think we can consider this a diversion anymore. So I need cannon fodder on location, ASAP, over," he said insistently. There was a brief pause on the other side, followed by the confused, and somewhat shocked reply of, "Come again?" "I need reinforcements, Central. I'll take command of the LZ when I get there, but I need bodies to back me up. I've only got 200 guys with me, and I really doubt that's going to be anywhere near enough to win this fight." Again there was a short pause, followed by, "DB-05631, give us a few minutes to discuss this and we'll get back to you." Paul swore. "Sounds like we're not getting any backup," he muttered. He then turned to his commanders, and said, "All right, everyone, listen up. We're less than 8 minutes out from the LZ and going in hot. Since Central has its head up its ass again, we're unlikely to get reinforcements anytime soon. So when we arrive, sit still and wait until I get a better idea of the situation. Got it?" "Yes, sir," shouted the others. As they continued to fly, Jack floated over to Paul and drew in close. "So we're not getting any backup, he shouted over the wind. "I think we eventually will. But until then we're entirely on our own," replied Paul. Jack frowned. "Well, ain't that just snafu," he said. Paul snorted. "Yeah, no kidding." Just then Paul's communicator crackled to life. "DB-05631, this is Central. Advise hands-off on all Rexes upon contact. All other monsters are fair game, over," came a voice. Jack and Paul looked at each other in confusion upon hearing this. "Say that again, Central?" asked Paul after a moment. "In exchange for his helping us win this battle, Tyrone has asked that we spare all of the Rexes from any harm or death. Any other monsters, however, are fair game." Paul and Jack looked at each other again in confusion. "Are they seriously asking us to let the enemy live?" asked Jack in disbelief. "They've only told us to ignore the Rexes, so I think that it's just Tyrone trying to save his people. I can't think of any other reason for him asking us to do that given who they are. But if there are any, I suspect we'll find out later," replied Paul. "Well, so long as they don't start hurting people, I'm fine with that, for now." Paul nodded. "Same here." He then activated his communicator, and said, "Acknowledged, Central. We'll hold fire on the Rexes as requested. But let Tyrone know that, if any of them start hurting people, we'll be forced to kill them. Acknowledged, DB05631. Tyrone is aware of this and wants you to know that, if they do so, then you may kill them. But if there is any way to spare them, please do." "Understood," replied Paul reluctantly. Jack, upon hearing this, frowned slightly. "This mission just keeps getting crazier by the minute," he muttered loudly. "No kidding," retorted Paul. The group then continued onward for another 7 minutes before Paul called for everyone to slow down and begin to hug the ground as he wanted to approach the monsters quietly and undetected, in order to surprise them. This would also allow him some time to examine the battlefield and gather as much intel as he could before they started fighting. However, as they drew close to their destination, he was shocked to discover that a small team of Guardians, African by descent, were already busy engaging the vast and powerful waves of monsters. Paul motioned for everyone to slow down more and descend further, as they continued to close in on the invasion area. Eventually they all stopped just above the treetops and floated there quietly as Paul took in the battle in front of them. To everyone's surprise, the African Guardians were battling the monsters with almost inhuman courage and tenacity. But, despite the incredible body count they'd already racked up, it was clear to Paul and the others that these fellow Guardians were fighting a losing battle. Even worse, they all appeared exhausted, and every last one of them was wounded, save for their commander, who floated just above them to better take in the battlefield. "It looks like we might have a chance in this fight," said Jack quietly. But Paul knew better. "This isn't a chance, so much as a better position than I thought we'd be in when we got here," he said as he narrowed his eyes. He then turned to the others, and said, "Jack, I want you to take your team and go relieve those Guardians. Tell them to pull back, heal, and recover themselves as we need them back to full strength as soon as possible. Also, when you take over for them, don't go all in. We don't have enough bodies for that. All I need you to do right now is to contain them long enough for reinforcements to arrive. James, I want you to go over there as well and be my liaison to the African Guardians. I'll need them to work closely with me to help us win this fight. Or, at least, hold down the fort until we have sufficient numbers to push back. So you accurately relaying my orders, and coordinating their responses, will be paramount. Also, make sure they understand that the Rexes are off limits for the time being. If they ask why, tell them it's orders from above. Got it?" "Yes, sir," said the two men, and then hurried away. As they did, Destin floated closer to Paul. "What do you want me to do, sir?" he asked. "You'll be my rapid reaction force. As I told Jack, we don't have enough bodies to stop them. The best we can do for now is to contain them until backup gets here. Also, to make the most efficient use of your forces, I'll need you to divide them up into 5-man fast reaction squads, sorta like military fire teams, with 1 man leading each team. As a Marine, I know you've been trained on how to do that. So get to it." Destin smiled at this, and then saluted Paul. "Yes, sir." He then hurried away to carry out his orders. As he did, Paul turned and surveyed the battlefield around him. Admittedly, while he had never been in the military, or even combat prior to becoming a Guardian, he felt born for this job. He also had an excellent group of men under him who he could rely on throughout the fight. So, if he did his job right, there would hopefully be few casualties. If not, then the entirety of mankind risked being wiped out. He then quietly watched as the fight continued to evolve around him as he floated higher into the sky to get a better view of the situation. Not far away, on a rocky bulge of land that rose up out of the African savanna, he spied a large, ornate stone circle. He could see that it was definitely a portal to another dimension, but not one he'd ever seen before. This one was far, far more advanced and stable. It also appeared to require significantly less energy to operate than any of the others he'd seen previously. This would be an important advantage for the Emperor's forces, given their reportedly limited, and rapidly dwindling energy reserves. As Paul studied it curiously, he quietly wondered to himself if destroying this single portal might help slow down the flow of monsters entering his dimension, or if doing so would merely shift the battle to another location, making the situation far worse than if it stayed here. At least, if it remained here, in the middle of nowhere, it would greatly reduce the chances of excessive civilian casualties. But, as he continued to ponder his choices, another portal, much like many of the others he'd seen before, appeared in the sky just above, and to the right of the first stone portal, and deposited another large, circular stone portal like the first next to it. This was soon replicated a second time, but on the opposite side of the first portal, leaving a total of 3 stone portals standing on the ground. It wasn't long before the other 2 portals opened, and a new flood of monsters began pouring through them. Seeing this, Paul's eyes again narrowed. The battle had just gotten a whole lot more difficult. He then activated his communicator, and said, "Central, I need bodies, ASAP. This is definitely the main invasion point. They've got some new kind of portal down here that's got a lot more transfer capacity than their normal ones, and they're using them to dump a ton of monsters on us. We need backup, and we need it as fast as you can get it to us." However, he got no reply. He frowned incredulously at this. Either Central was so overwhelmed that it couldn't reply, or it was simply not there anymore. The latter was a real possibility if the Emperor had opened multiple fronts, with one of them being focused directly against Central itself. If that were true, then there was absolutely no hope of him receiving any reinforcements at all. Ever. He then activated his communicator again. "To all Guardians within the sound of my voice, I am declaring a condition Broken Arrow. We're currently in the nation of Chad, in the region of Borku, engaging a large cohort of other dimensional monsters, and are heavily outnumbered. If you're able to, please converge on my location as soon as possible. We'll hold them in check until you can arrive, but please hurry," he said. Silence. Paul frowned at this. He'd kinda expected that. He then narrowed his eyes as he turned his entire attention back to the battle before him. If nobody else came, then they were all that stood between humanity and total annihilation. There might be many other teams around the world fighting the same battle that they were. But that did little to help him in his current situation. Paul quietly examined the battlefield in detail once more, but soon frowned at what he saw. Realizing the terrible situation they were in, he reached out to all of his teams. "James, tell the African Guardians to direct their attention to the monsters on the ground. Jack, get your teams in the air. Those skyrapers above us are going to be our biggest threat. Take them down as fast as you can. Destin, keep doing what you're doing and give support to whoever needs you the most. Don't let anything escape if you can," he said. "Yes, sir," came the replies. Just then 2 of the large, almost pterodactyl-like monsters, known as skyrapers, who'd only recently come through the 3 gates, turned and rushed his way, screaming loudly as they did. Paul frowned at this, fired 2 well-targeted shots, and shot both of them out of the air, sending them crashing to the ground. To his dismay, however, they both landed safely, and in better shape than he would have liked. He grunted at this, but paid no further attention to them as he needed to focus his attention elsewhere for now. He could come back and finish them off later when he had time. Meanwhile, down on the ground, the leader of the African Guardian team pushed his forces forward into the fray, not holding back in their fight, to the complete chagrin of James, who had told them not to, and began cutting a gruesome and gory path through a line of large Yeti-like monsters that were charging at them. Jack and his team, on the other hand, were busy elsewhere dealing with a group of bulls that had turned and begun charging at them. At first they hit the bulls with powerful energy blasts, just as they had with so many others before them. But, despite the strength of their attacks, they found themselves unable to wound any of the bulls. As the bulls rapidly closed on his team, Jack ordered his men into the air and safely out of their way. However, one of his men was slow in doing so, and got his leg caught by one of the bulls. To his shocked surprise, it immediately shriveled up, and appeared almost as if it had been burned away. Upon seeing this, Jack realized why they had been unable to hurt the bulls. They were black bulls, the same kind that Paul had encountered at Edwards Elementary. To test this theory, Jack summoned a large ball of water, and dropped it on one of the bulls. To his welcome surprise, the bull immediately melted away. "They're black bulls. Hit him with water," he shouted over the din of battle. His men turned and looked at him in confusion, uncertain if they'd heard him right. They then watched him summon another water ball and heave it at a nearby black bull, which sliced it in two, after which it disintegrated into a pile of strangely colored ash. Realizing what had just happened, and what he'd just shown them, the others did the same. Moments later, numerous fountains of water burst forth from his team like a wall of fire hoses and drenched the bulls in a thick, watery barrage. To their welcome surprise and relief, their attacks worked, and completely wiped out the stampede of black bulls. But not all of the attacking bulls were black bulls. So the men returned to fighting them the same way they did the other monsters. However, despite these small victories, the more monsters they killed, the more came through the gateways, endlessly, and without stop. Clearly the Emperor had far more forces available to him than either Paul or really anyone else realized. Paul was now starting to wonder if they would have enough Guardians on the entire planet to deal with this invasion without a significant loss of human life. At the rate things were going, it was unlikely that the human casualties, which would result from this invasion, would be anything but low. He then continued studying the battle from his position high above the savannah. As he did, Skyrapers repeatedly swept in to attack him in an effort to knock him out of the fight. Paul, in turn, effortlessly blasted them out of the sky as if they were mere bugs. For an enemy of their substantial size, they were surprisingly easy to take down. He then returned his attention back to the battle. As he did, he couldn't help but notice that, despite their best efforts, and the ever-increasing number of dead monsters laying on the ground around them, the enemy's numbers just kept increasing, and increasing, and increasing. His eyes soon narrowed. Even though they were doing all they could to win, their efforts were proving to be woefully insufficient to turn the tide in their favor. In short, they were losing, and badly. Paul quietly wondered just how many of these monsters the Emperor had, and what the two Rexes, who he had first met some weeks earlier, considered to be a dwindling number of forces. Based on what he was seeing, if this is what they believed to be a small force, then his idea of such, and theirs, differed greatly. As he continued to watch the battle progress, he soon noticed that some of his most deeply involved Guardians were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. If they didn't disengage soon, they would become injured, or even die. Destin, James, Jack, your teams are flagging. Rotate out your most exhausted men and send them to the back to rest and recover, and then bring your freshest guys to the front to replace them. If we don't, they're gonna get hurt, he said over the communicator. You know we're losing this fight, right? Came Jack's voice. Paul frowned. I'm aware of that. But we need to hold out until reinforcements arrive, he replied. Paul soon heard a frustrated grunt from the other side. All right, then we'll do what we can, said Jack. Paul sighed. I know this isn't going how we wanted it to, but we've gotta stay in this fight as long as we can, or the planet is toast. Roger. Paul sighed quietly to himself as he could hear the frustration in Jack's voice. He felt it too. But there was nothing he could do. Central had completely abandoned them, and that was making things far worse than they needed to be. He then activated his communicator again. Central, if you're still there, this is DB05631 requesting reinforcements in the Chad LZ. Situation is deteriorating rapidly and we need backup, over, he said. However, only silence greeted him. Central, we're getting overrun here, and are unable to contain the inbound hostiles. We need those reinforcements, now, he continued. Again, his call for help was greeted with silence. Paul swore, and then shot a Sky Reaper out of the air as it made a strafing run at him. The Sky Reaper spun wildly out of control and impacted a nearby rock protrusion moments later, killing it instantly. Paul smirked at this incredulously. At least one of them had finally died. He then watched in dismay as the largest group of monsters, consisting of bulls, yeti, and a multitude of other creatures, some of which defied logical description, began to pour out of the area and charge westward. He glanced back at his men, but saw that there was no way they were going to be able to contain those other monsters, as they were barely able to keep up with the ones they were already fighting. His eyes narrowed. This was a rather poor time to get completely abandoned. However, just as he was thinking about this, something happened that surprised everyone. Suddenly, out of nowhere, in the air just above the 3 stone circles, a gigantic dimensional portal opened. But this one was easily 100 times greater in size than any of the others. Whatever was about to come through it was going to be massive. Seeing this, Paul called out to the others over the communicator and warned them about it. Moments later a swarm of tentacles burst through the portal and spread out into the area around it. Paul's heart leapt with fear as this happened. "Fall back! Fall back! Get clear of the area," he shouted over the communicator. Everyone in his team, including their African allies, all disengaged from their respective battles and immediately fell back. They then regrouped around Paul, but still kept their distance from one another to ensure that they couldn't all be taken out in a single attack. As they floated there above the ground, they watched in horror as the tentacles briefly thrashed around in the air before withdrawing into the portal. A few moments later a massive body, easily big enough to make Paul's entire team look like a swarm of tiny gnats, began to appear through the portal. As soon as it had fully emerged out the other side, the portal flickered, and then vanished. However, the original 3 stone portals remained open as hundreds upon hundreds of new monsters continued to pour through them. Paul studied this briefly, and then turned his attention towards the massive octopus-like monster floating above them. His eyes soon narrowed as he frowned in dismay. "What the hell is that thing?" cried Jack in surprise. Paul let out a deep, frustrated, angry sigh in reply. "That is the Emperor of Ashes."